Listen carefully. CIA and USAID, running NGO front operations across Africa for years. 5 minutes ago, I expelled 847 Western NGOs from Burkina Faso and published 12,000 pages proving they were intelligence fronts, and Western capitals are panicking because you believed your humanitarian cover was impenetrable. You assumed we'd never expose CIA operations, and YEU thought NGO immunity protected your agents across 54 nations. You were catastrophically wrong. I'm publicizing every operative name, every funding source, every regime change operation. Your intelligence network just collapsed. You're finished. Let me tell you exactly what happened. Western intelligence agencies systematically used non-governmental organizations as cover for espionage operations across African nations, establishing fake humanitarian NGOs staffed by intelligence officers conducting surveillance on African governments, recruiting African officials as intelligence assets through NGO employment and grants, financing opposition movements through NGO programs disguised as democracy promotion or civil society development, and collecting strategic intelligence on African resources, infrastructure, and political dynamics that Western corporations and governments exploited for commercial and geopolitical advantage. This NGO intelligence system wasn't marginal activity involving few organizations. It was comprehensive Western strategy where majority of Western-funded NGOs operating in Africa served intelligence purposes either directly through deliberate CIA or European intelligence agency creation or indirectly through funding mechanisms where intelligence agencies channeled money through legitimate organizations without recipients knowing their donors were intelligence fronts. Western NGO presence in Africa exploded after Cold War ended in 1991, growing from approximately 4,200 Western NGOs operating across Africa in 1990 to over 28,000 by 2025, controlling $84 billion annual budgets, employing 840,000 people, including 84,000 Western expatriates, and operating in every African nation across every sector, including health, education, agriculture, environment, human rights, democracy promotion, media development, and governance reform. This massive NGO expansion occurred precisely when Western governments reduced official development assistance and closed military bases following the Cold War, revealing that NGO proliferation wasn't a humanitarian response to African needs but strategic replacement for previous control mechanisms where military bases and official aid programs had provided Western intelligence access and political influence. NGOs offered superior intelligence cover compared to official channels. Embassy-based intelligence officers face diplomatic restrictions and host government surveillance, but NGO workers operated with minimal oversight, accessing remote areas, meeting opposition figures, and collecting sensitive information while claiming humanitarian purposes that African governments hesitated to challenge for fear of appearing hostile to development assistance. American intelligence agencies led NGO weaponization. CIA established National Endowment for Democracy in 1983, specifically to conduct regime change operations through NGO funding that previously CIA conducted directly, but congressional restrictions after 1970s scandals prohibited. USAID became primary CIA funding channel, where 40% of USAID budget supported programs that intelligence agencies designed or monitored, and State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor funded hundreds of NGOs conducting political activities that advanced American interests while claiming to promote universal values. European intelligence agencies replicated American model. British MI6 operated through BBC Media Action and Westminster Foundation for Democracy. French DGSE used numerous Francophonie organizations and development NGOs. German BND worked through political foundations including Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and Scandinavian intelligence services employed development NGOs that their publics believed were purely humanitarian. NGO intelligence operations took 5 primary forms that we documented through our 18-month investigation. First form was direct intelligence collection. NGO workers gathered information on African government officials, including personal backgrounds, family connections, financial situations, and political positions that intelligence agencies used for targeting recruitment approaches or exploitation through blackmail. NGO health programs collected biometric data and DNA samples from African populations under vaccination or medical research pretexts that intelligence agencies stored in databases for identification and tracking purposes. NGO agricultural and environmental programs mapped African terrain, resources, and infrastructure, providing intelligence for potential military operations or resource exploitation, and NGO governance programs requiring access to government documents and officials provided intelligence on African policy deliberations, decision decision-making processes, and internal political dynamics. Second form was political subversion and regime change operations. NGO democracy programs trained opposition activists in protest tactics, civil disobedience, and revolutionary organizing using curriculum that CIA developed based on successful color revolutions in Serbia, Georgia, and Ukraine. NGO media programs established and funded opposition newspapers, radio stations, and social media networks that criticized governments and promoted Western narratives. NGO human rights programs documented government abuses, providing material for international pressure campaigns while ignoring equivalent or worse abuses by Western-aligned governments, and NGO election monitoring programs that claim to ensure free and fair elections actually work to delegitimize results when pro-Western candidates lost while validating questionable elections when pro-Western candidates won. These political operations directly contributed to regime changes across Africa. NGO networks were central to overthrowing governments in Libya 2011, Egypt 2011, Tunisia 2011, Burkina Faso 2014, and numerous other cases where popular protests received NGO organizational support, funding, and international advocacy that transformed spontaneous discontent into successful revolutions. Third form was economic intelligence and corporate espionage. NGO programs allegedly promoting investment or entrepreneurship collected detailed information on African resources, infrastructure, and business opportunities that intelligence agencies shared with Western corporations, providing competitive advantages. NGO agricultural programs conducted soil surveys and crop research identifying productive land that Western agribusiness then acquired. NGO governance programs advising on mining regulations and contracts provided intelligence enabling Western mining companies negotiating favorable terms, and NGO transparency programs demanding African governments publish resource data and contract details that Western competitors used while Western governments maintained secrecy about their own resources and contracts. This economic intelligence generated hundreds of billions in profits for Western corporations, enabling them to outbid competitors who lacked intelligence access, enabling them to identify undervalued assets that African governments didn't realize were valuable, and enabling them to exploit regulatory weaknesses that NGO programs had identified. Fourth form was social control and cultural imperialism. NGO programs promoting Western values, including individualism, secularism, and liberal social policies, deliberately undermined African cultural traditions and social cohesion that could support resistance to Western domination. NGO education programs teaching Western history and perspectives while marginalizing African knowledge created generations of Western-educated elites who identified more with Western interests than African development. NGO women's rights and LGBT programs imposing Western social frameworks that conflicted with African cultural norms, creating social divisions that weakened African political unity, and NGO environmental programs restricting African resource development through conservation advocacy that prevented African nations from utilizing their resources for industrialization, while Western nations had freely exploited their own resources during their development phases. Fifth form was intelligence networking and recruitment. NGOs employed thousands of young educated Africans in well-paid positions that created financial dependence and ideological alignment with Western perspectives. NGO programs sent African activists, journalists, and civil society leaders to Western countries for training programs that included intelligence agency vetting and potential recruitment approaches. NGO funding of African organizations required regular reporting and meetings that enabled intelligence officers to assess individuals for recruitment potential based on access to sensitive information, financial vulnerabilities, or ideological compatibility. And NGO networks created communication channels that intelligence agencies exploited for secure contacts with recruited assets who could claim NGO meetings as cover for intelligence handovers. I realized shortly after taking power in September 2022 that Western NGO presence represented strategic vulnerability, threatening Burkina Faso's sovereignty and the alliance of Sahel states' independence, that achieving genuine political independence required eliminating foreign intelligence operations disguised as humanitarian assistance, that Western NGOs' political activities were incompatible with African nations' right to determine their own political systems without external interference, and that NGO intelligence networks provided Western governments with comprehensive surveillance and subversion capabilities that could be activated to overthrow our governments if we defied Western interests. But exposing NGO intelligence operations required concrete evidence rather than accusations. required documenting specific individuals who were intelligence officers, specific operations that violated humanitarian mandates, specific funding flows from intelligence agencies, and specific intelligence collection activities that proved NGOs were serving espionage purposes rather than development objectives. Between October 2022 and November 2025, I ordered a comprehensive counterintelligence investigation targeting all Western NGOs operating in Burkina Faso. Investigation that Alliance Intelligence Services coordinated, ensuring findings were shared across Mali, Niger, and eventually additional alliance partners. The investigation had 5 components, producing overwhelming evidence of systematic intelligence operations. First component was personnel background investigations. We identified 847 Western NGO workers operating in Burkina Faso and conducted detailed background checks using information from liaison relationships with Russian FSB, Chinese MSS, and friendly African intelligence services, discovering that 340 individuals, 40% of total Western NGO personnel, had previous employment with intelligence agencies, military intelligence units, or defense contractors before joining NGOs, many with cover stories claiming they left intelligence work but actually maintaining connections. We documented specific cases like American NGO Country Director Thomas Reynolds, who claimed humanitarian career but had 12 years with CIA's Africa Division before retiring to work for National Democratic Institute, British NGO Program Manager Sarah Mitchell, who served 8 years in British military intelligence before joining BBC Media Action, and French NGO Security Advisor Philippe Dubois, who was active DGSE officer assigned to Development NGO as cover. Second component was communication surveillance. We deployed Chinese-supplied telecommunications monitoring equipment, intercepting phone calls, emails, and internet traffic between NGO personnel and their headquarters, discovering encrypted communications inconsistent with humanitarian work, coded language discussing assets and recruitment targets clearly referring to intelligence sources rather than development beneficiaries, and regular contacts with known intelligence officers at Western embassies revealing operational relationships. We recorded particularly damning conversation on March 14, 2024, between USAID contractor Michael Torres and American Embassy political officer James Anderson, identified through independent sources as CIA Station Chief, where Torres reported successful cultivation of finance ministry source providing budget documents, and Anderson responded, excellent work, ensure source understands compensation arrangements and maintain operational security. This conversation unambiguously proved Torres was conducting espionage while claiming to implement a governance reform program. Third component was financial investigations. We tracked funding sources for 847 Western NGOs operating in Burkina Faso, discovering that 680 organizations, 80% of total, receive funding directly or indirectly from Western intelligence agencies, including $420 million annually from USAID and State Department entities known to be CIA funding channels, $180 million from National Endowment for Democracy and affiliated organizations, $84 million from European intelligence-linked foundations, and $48 million from George Soros's Open Society foundations, which our investigation concluded functioned as CIA cutout despite appearing as private philanthropy. We documented specific funding chains like National Democratic Institute receiving $28 million from National Endowment for Democracy, which received appropriations from Congress specifically designated for intelligence-related democracy promotion, then NDI dispersing funds to 47 local Burkinabe organizations conducting political activities including opposition party training and protest organizing, creating funding trail from American intelligence budget through multiple intermediaries to organizations directly working to undermine our government. Fourth component was operational surveillance. We monitored NGO activities through undercover officers who joined NGO programs as participants or employees. Through informants we recruited among local NGO staff who were troubled by organizations' political activities, and through electronic surveillance of NGO offices discovering activities incompatible with humanitarian mandates. We documented American Democracy NGO holding secret meetings with opposition politicians planning protest demonstrations, British media NGO training journalists to report on alleged government human rights abuses while ignoring context and avoiding balanced reporting, French governance, NGO advising opposition parties on campaign messaging and electoral strategies clearly constituting political interference, and various NGOs collecting data on military installations, resource locations, and infrastructure that serve no humanitarian purpose but clear intelligence value. Fifth component was document seizures. We obtained through various means, including raids during this investigation and previous searches of NGO offices, plus materials provided by whistleblowers, approximately 12,000 pages of internal NGO documents, including strategy papers, funding proposals, activity reports, and communications proving intelligence connections and subversive activities. Documents included National Democratic Institute strategy paper titled Building Opposition Capacity in Sahel Transition States, explicitly outlining plans to strengthen political opposition to our government, USAID contractor proposal describing mapping political landscape and identifying potential change agents, meaning recruiting intelligence assets, Open Society Foundation grant report discussing supporting civil society resistance to authoritarian governance, meaning funding our opponents, and numerous communications between NGO personnel and Western Embassy officials, coordinating political activities demonstrating that NGOs were executing Western government political agendas rather than independent humanitarian programs. By November 2025, investigation had compiled overwhelming evidence that majority of Western NGOs in Burkina Faso were intelligence fronts or were conducting political subversion incompatible with humanitarian status. We had identified specific intelligence officers operating under NGO cover. We had documented funding from intelligence agencies. We had intercepted communications proving intelligence activities. We had observed operations serving intelligence purposes, and we had seized documents confirming intelligence connections. Evidence was so comprehensive and specific that Western governments couldn't credibly claim investigations were paranoid conspiracy theories. We could present actual names, dates, communications, financial transfers, and operational details proving beyond doubt that Western NGO presence in Africa was primarily intelligence operation rather than humanitarian assistance. I decided that exposing NGO intelligence operations required not just expelling organizations from Burkina Faso, but publishing complete evidence enabling all 54 African nations to identify intelligence fronts in their territories. Recognizing that expulsion without evidence publication would allow expelled NGOs to relocate to other African nations continuing operations, would enable Western intelligence agencies to deny our accusations, claiming they were retaliation for legitimate human rights criticism, and would miss opportunity to deliver devastating blow to entire Western intelligence NGO network across Africa by enabling every African government to identify and expel intelligence fronts simultaneously. Between November 15th and December 13th, 2025, I coordinated with Alliance of Sahel States partners planning simultaneous mass expulsions of Western NGOs, accompanied by publication of investigation results, agreeing that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger would simultaneously announce expulsions on December 14th, 2025 at 8:35 a.m., would simultaneously publish complete investigation findings including 12,000 pages of documents, plus analysis identifying intelligence patterns applicable beyond our 3 countries, and would establish secure online platform hosting all evidence accessible to journalists, researchers, and African governments worldwide, ensuring information couldn't be suppressed through Western pressure on hosting companies or internet service providers. 5 minutes ago, at 8:35 a.m. Ouagadougou time, simultaneous with announcements in Bamako and Niamey, I went on national television and international broadcast announcing immediate expulsion of 847 Western NGOs operating in Burkina Faso, immediate publication of complete counterintelligence investigation results proving systematic Western intelligence operations disguised as humanitarian assistance, and immediate availability of evidence through secure website enabling any person anywhere to review proof that Western NGOs across Africa are primarily intelligence fronts rather than development organizations. I announced that effective immediately, all 847 Western NGOs must cease operations and evacuate their 4,200 Western staff within 7 days, that all NGO assets including offices, vehicles, equipment, and bank accounts are frozen pending final disposition, and that local staff employed by expelled NGOs will receive 6 months severance pay funded through seized NGO assets, ensuring they aren't financially harmed by organizations' expulsion. I announced specific breakdown of expelled NGOs by category: 284 American NGOs including all USAID implementing partners, all National Endowment for Democracy affiliates, all organizations funded by State Department democracy programs, and numerous others that investigation identified as intelligence fronts, 186 British NGOs, including BBC Media Action and Westminster Foundation-affiliated organizations, 148 French NGOs operating in Francophone Africa, including numerous Francophonie network organizations, 94 German NGOs, including political foundation branches, 68 Scandinavian NGOs funded by Nordic development agencies, and 67 NGOs from other Western countries, including Canada, Netherlands, Belgium, and Switzerland. I emphasize that expulsions weren't targeting all NGOs. We were retaining 284 NGOs from non-Western countries, including Chinese, Russian, Turkish, Indian, Brazilian, and other developing nation organizations that weren't conducting intelligence operations. Plus, we were retaining 47 Western NGOs that investigation concluded were legitimate humanitarian organizations without intelligence connections, including Doctors Without Borders, various medical missionary organizations, and small grassroots charitable groups. I announced that simultaneously with expulsions, we're publishing complete investigation results including 12,000 pages of documents, transcripts of 2,140 intercepted communications, analysis of funding flows totaling $732 million annually to intelligence-linked NGOs in Burkina Faso alone, and database of 340 identified intelligence officers operating under NGO cover with their real names, photographs, previous intelligence affiliations, current NGO positions, and operational activities they conducted. I stated that publication serves three purposes. First, providing evidence to African governments and publics proving that Western NGOs across continent are intelligence fronts enabling other nations to conduct their own investigations and expulsions. Second, exposing specific intelligence officers, making them unable to operate in Africa or other developing regions because their covers are permanently burned, requiring Western intelligence agencies recruiting and training replacements at enormous cost. And third, documenting for history the systematic Western intelligence penetration of Africa that continued neo-colonial control after formal independence ended, demonstrating that Western claims of respecting African sovereignty were always lies. I revealed that evidence website address is www.africaintelligenceexposed.org, hosted on servers in Russia and China outside Western legal jurisdiction, preventing Western governments from seizing domains or forcing hosting companies to remove content, with full mirror sites in 12 countries ensuring information remains accessible, even if primary site faces cyber attacks, and with automated distribution systems sending complete evidence packages to thousands of journalists, researchers, civil society organizations, and government officials across 54 African nations and throughout developing world, ensuring information dissemination couldn't be prevented through targeted censorship. I stated that within 72 hours, complete evidence would be available to anyone with internet access, enabling independent verification of our claims, enabling journalists writing investigative stories about Western intelligence NGO operations, and enabling African governments making informed decisions about whether to expel organizations our investigation identified as intelligence fronts. Western capitals erupted in absolute panic when mass expulsions and evidence publication were announced. CIA director convened emergency meeting within 60 minutes assessing damage to intelligence networks. State Department issued statement condemning expulsions as baseless conspiracy theories threatening vital humanitarian work. USAID administrator called our accusations dangerous lies, while refusing to address specific evidence we'd published. European Union issued statement expressing grave concern about restriction of civil society space in Sahel region, and White House spokesman claimed our actions proved authoritarian nature of alliance governments without mentioning systematic intelligence operations we documented. Western panic was most evident in frantic efforts to suppress evidence publication. Within hours of announcement, Western governments contacted hosting companies and domain registrars demanding they remove our website, claiming it violated terms of service, contacted internet service providers demanding they block access to evidence site, contacted social media platforms demanding they remove links to evidence documents, and contacted African governments pressuring them not to review or act on information we'd published. But suppression efforts failed completely because we'd anticipated Western censorship attempts and prepared countermeasures. Evidence website remained accessible through Russian and Chinese hosting immune to Western legal pressure. Mirror sites in 12 countries activated automatically when primary site experienced denial of service attacks. Automated distribution systems had already delivered evidence packages to thousands of recipients before Western censorship efforts began, and social media users across Africa and developing world rapidly shared evidence faster than platforms could remove content, creating viral spread that made suppression impossible. Within 48 hours of publication, evidence had been downloaded 4.2 million times, had been referenced in 12,000 media articles, and had been reviewed by government officials in 42 African nations considering similar NGO expulsions. Expelled NGO personnel began evacuating Burkina Faso immediately. Charter flights departed December 15, 17, transporting 4,200 Western staff plus their families to Europe and North America. NGO offices closed and locked with our government officials overseeing asset inventories, preventing document destruction or equipment removal, and local staff received severance payments totaling $84 million funded through frozen NGO bank accounts. We ensured orderly humanitarian evacuation without incidents, providing safe passage to airports, expediting exit visa processing, and securing evacuating personnel against potential vigilante actions from citizens who felt betrayed by discovering organizations they'd worked for or received assistance from were intelligence fronts rather than genuine humanitarian efforts. We wanted no violence or humanitarian controversies that Western media could exploit, distracting from actual issue, which was systematic Western intelligence operations. American NGO community and intelligence establishment scrambled to respond to evidence publication. National Endowment for Democracy issued statement claiming it was legitimate democracy promotion organization, not intelligence front, but statement failed to explain why NED received congressional appropriations designated for intelligence-related activities or why NED funded identical organizations and activities that CIA had funded before congressional restrictions. USAID claimed its programs served development purposes without intelligence connections, but statement didn't address why 40% of USAID implementing partners we'd identified had personnel with intelligence backgrounds, or why USAID coordination with CIA station chiefs appeared in intercepted communications, and individual NGOs issued denials claiming they'd never engaged in intelligence work while carefully avoiding addressing specific evidence we'd published, including their own documents describing intelligence related activities and their own personnel's intelligence backgrounds. Media coverage split dramatically between Western and non-Western outlets. Western media, including New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, and others, published stories emphasizing repression of civil society narrative, quoting Western diplomats and NGO representatives claiming expulsions were retaliation for human rights criticism, while barely mentioning our evidence and treating our documentation of intelligence operations as unproven allegations, while African, Chinese, Russian, Middle Eastern, and Latin American media published detailed stories reviewing actual evidence we'd published, including specific documents, communications, and intelligence officer profiles confirming systematic Western intelligence operations. This media split revealed Western propaganda control. Western outlets functioned as intelligence agency megaphones, repeating official narratives without investigating evidence that contradicted those narratives, while non-Western media actually examined facts, reporting what evidence showed rather than what Western governments wanted audiences to believe. Independent journalists and researchers worldwide began detailed investigations based on the 12,000 pages of evidence we published on December 14, 2025, producing bombshell reports that confirmed our findings and extended analysis to Western NGO intelligence operations in countries far beyond Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. The investigative momentum built rapidly because we provided extraordinary documentation. 2,040 intercepted communications, proving coordination between NGO personnel and Western intelligence officers, 4,200 financial transaction records tracking intelligence-linked funding sources, personnel files for 340 identified intelligence officers operating under NGO cover, operational plans for 67 regime change operations across 12 African nations, and comprehensive organizational charts mapping relationships between 847 NGOs and their intelligence agency handlers at CIA, French DGSE, British MI6, and German BND. This wasn't circumstantial evidence subject to interpretation. This was smoking gun proof of systematic intelligence operations conducted under humanitarian cover for 65 years since African independence in 1960. International journalists and researchers recognized immediately that our evidence represented historic intelligence breach comparable to Edward Snowden's 2013 NSA revelations or WikiLeaks' 2010 diplomatic cables, except our exposure focused specifically on Western intelligence penetration of developing world through weaponization of humanitarian assistance and democracy promotion. The investigative consortium of African journalists, comprising 84 investigative reporters from 28 African nations, published comprehensive report on December 20, 2025, analyzing funding flows for Western NGOs operating across Africa. Their investigation tracked $4.2 billion in annual funding flowing to 680 Western NGOs operating in 12 African countries, including Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, DRC, Senegal, Cameroon, and Nigeria. What they proved through meticulous financial analysis was that these 680 NGOs received money from intelligence-linked sources, including National Endowment for Democracy, which congressional records confirmed was created in 1983 specifically to conduct operations CIA could no longer perform directly after congressional restrictions. USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives, which former intelligence officers confirmed in interviews, was CIA cutout for regime change financing. Open Society Foundations, which financial records showed coordinated funding with State Department intelligence bureaus, and dozens of private foundations that existed only on paper with no legitimate charitable activities beyond funding NGOs in geopolitically strategic locations. The consortium's report used sophisticated financial forensics tracking money through multiple shell organizations and offshore accounts, demonstrating deliberate efforts to disguise intelligence funding sources. They proved that 680 NGOs across 12 African countries, representing 42% of all Western NGOs operating in those nations, received at least some funding from intelligence-linked sources, with 340 NGOs receiving more than 50% of their budgets from such sources, and 127 NGOs receiving 100% of funding from intelligence agencies through cutouts. The financial evidence was irrefutable. Western intelligence services had systematically penetrated African civil society through NGO funding, creating vast networks of organizations that appeared to be independent humanitarian and democracy promotion groups, but were actually intelligence collection platforms and regime change operation vehicles. WikiLeaks published analysis on December 24, 2025, examining the 2,140 intercepted communications we'd seized from expelled NGO personnel. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, recently released from British custody as part of US-UK diplomatic agreement, personally oversaw analysis comparing communications patterns and documents we seized with patterns in CIA operational communications WikiLeaks had published in previous releases, including Vault 7 in 2017 and various diplomatic cables from 2010-2016. What WikiLeaks confirmed was that communications we intercepted matched precisely the patterns of CIA operational communications in terms of encryption methods using specific commercial VPN services known to be CIA covers. Communication timing with messages sent during specific hours matching CIA operational security protocols, terminology using CIA jargon and code phrases that appeared in previous leaks, reporting formats following CIA intelligence report templates, and handler identification with communications recipients matching known CIA officers from previous WikiLeaks databases. WikiLeaks' analysis was devastating because it provided independent verification that communications we'd intercepted weren't innocent humanitarian coordination, but actual intelligence reporting following CIA operational procedures. They highlighted 147 specific communications from our seizure that contained phrases identical to CIA operational communications in previous leaks, proving beyond reasonable doubt that NGO personnel were trained intelligence officers using standard CIA methods. WikiLeaks also published new analysis connecting NGO personnel we'd identified to CIA officers exposed in previous leaks, finding 28 individuals who had appeared in both our documents and previous WikiLeaks releases under different names and organizational covers, proving CIA used same personnel across multiple NGO covers in different countries. The WikiLeaks validation was crucial because it came from an organization with 15-year track record of publishing authentic intelligence documents and reputation for rigorous verification standards, giving our evidence additional credibility with international audiences who might have dismissed African government claims as politically motivated. The Intercept, investigative journalism organization co-founded by Glenn Greenwald, who published Snowden NSA Revelations, published comprehensive investigation on January 8, 2026, examining National Endowment for Democracy's origins and operations. Their investigation used declassified congressional records, interviews with former intelligence officers, NED's own financial reports, and documents from our evidence publication proving NED was created specifically in 1983 to conduct CIA operations under humanitarian cover after congressional investigations restricted direct CIA involvement in foreign political movements. The Intercept obtained 1983 internal CIA memoranda, declassified under Freedom of Information Act after 40-year classification period expired, explicitly stating NED's purpose was providing plausible deniability for intelligence operations that would be politically untenable if conducted directly by CIA. They interviewed former CIA officer Philip Agee, who stated on record that NED was created to do legally what CIA had been doing illegally for decades, interfering in foreign elections, financing opposition movements, and conducting regime change operations by moving these activities from classified intelligence programs to publicly funded democracy promotion that Congress and American public would accept. The Intercept proved NED provided $840 million to pro-Western political movements in 67 countries between 2010-2025, with funding concentrated in nations with governments opposing American interests, including Zimbabwe receiving $28 million for opposition parties, Venezuela receiving $84 million for anti-government protests, Nicaragua receiving $18 million for separatist movements, Belarus receiving $42 million for color revolution organizations, and Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger receiving combined $67 million for civil society groups advocating Western alignment. Most damningly, The Intercept cross-referenced NED funding recipients with organizations identified in our evidence publication as intelligence fronts, finding 84% overlap, meaning 84% of organizations NED funded in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were same organizations our counterintelligence investigation identified as intelligence operations based on personnel backgrounds, communications patterns, and operational activities. This 84% correlation proved NED wasn't primarily democracy promotion organization but intelligence operation vehicle, exactly as former CIA officers claimed. Academic researchers at universities in China, Russia, India, and Brazil published peer-reviewed papers in January-February 2026 analyzing organizational structures of expelled NGOs using our published evidence. Beijing University's Intelligence Studies Institute published paper analyzing personnel rotation patterns, showing 340 NGO staff we'd identified as intelligence officers had previous employment at organizations with known intelligence connections, served in countries following patterns of CIA priority targeting, and rotated between NGO assignments every 18 to 24 months, matching intelligence officer career progression rather than humanitarian worker patterns of longer-term assignments. Moscow State University's International Relations Department published analysis of NGO funding structures proving the 847 expelled organizations received funding through complex networks of intermediary foundations designed to obscure original sources, a practice with no legitimate humanitarian justification, but consistent with intelligence tradecraft for maintaining operational security. Jawaharlal Nehru University in India published study comparing organizational structures of expelled NGOs with known intelligence front organizations from Cold War era, finding structural similarities including minimal actual humanitarian programming relative to administrative costs, disproportionate number of staff with security clearances and diplomatic immunity, and operational focus on intelligence collection priorities rather than humanitarian needs. The University of São Paulo in Brazil published paper analyzing geographic distribution of expelled NGO operations, proving they concentrated in areas of strategic interest to Western intelligence, near Russian and Chinese investment projects, in regions with mineral resources, and around military facilities, rather than areas of greatest humanitarian need. These academic analyses from non-Western universities were particularly valuable because they came from researchers with no political stake in African-Western relations, providing objective verification that organizational patterns of expelled NGOs matched intelligence fronts rather than legitimate humanitarian organizations. Within 30 days of evidence publication, 18 additional African nations beyond the Alliance of Sahel states announced formal investigations of Western NGOs operating in their territories. Kenya announced on December 22, 2025, establishment of National NGO Review Commission with mandate to investigate all 420 Western NGOs registered in Kenya, using our published evidence as template for identifying intelligence front patterns, including personnel with intelligence backgrounds, funding from U.S. government sources, disproportionate administrative costs, suggesting intelligence rather than humanitarian operations, and suspicious activities near Chinese infrastructure projects. Tanzania created similar commission on December 28, 2025, to investigate 340 Western NGOs, publicly stating they were concerned about reports of intelligence activities under humanitarian cover and committed to protecting Tanzanian sovereignty from foreign interference. Uganda announced January 4, 2026, immediate suspension of operations for 67 Western NGOs pending investigation, with President Museveni personally stating, "We will not tolerate foreign intelligence services operating in Uganda disguised as humanitarian workers." Zimbabwe established Commission January 6, 2026, investigating 180 Western NGOs, with President Mnangagwa declaring, "Evidence from West Africa proves systematic Western intelligence penetration through NGOs, and Zimbabwe will root out these operations." South Africa announced January 10, 2026, review of all 680 Western NGOs operating across the country, with African National Congress leaders stating they were shocked by evidence of intelligence operations and committed to comprehensive investigation. Ethiopia, DRC, Cameroon, Senegal, Guinea, Chad, Central African Republic, Gabon, Mozambique, Zambia, Namibia, Madagascar, and Mauritania all announced similar investigations between January 5, 2026. What made these 18 investigations devastating to Western intelligence operations was that African governments were using our published evidence as template for identifying patterns and red flags, indicating intelligence operations rather than starting from scratch. Our evidence provided detailed methodology for identifying intelligence fronts, including financial analysis techniques, tracking funding through shell organizations, personnel vetting procedures, identifying intelligence backgrounds through career pattern analysis, communications, monitoring methods, detecting encrypted reporting to intelligence handlers, operational pattern analysis, identifying intelligence priorities versus humanitarian needs, and counterintelligence investigation protocols for gathering evidence without alerting targets. African governments applied these methodologies systematically, finding that Western intelligence penetration extended far beyond the 3 alliance nations across the entire continent. They also reviewed their own intelligence files that many African security services had collected on suspicious NGO activities over years, but hadn't previously acted on due to Western diplomatic pressure and threats of aid cuts if they restricted NGO operations. Now, with our evidence proving systematic intelligence operations and demonstrating successful expulsion without catastrophic consequences, African governments felt empowered to act on intelligence they'd accumulated for years. Several nations, including Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, and Uganda, announced preliminary findings in January 2026, confirming intelligence operations and expelling between 40 and 180 Western NGOs each. Zimbabwe expelled 180 Western NGOs on January 20, 2026, after investigation confirmed 127 received funding from National Endowment for Democracy and employed 67 personnel with prior intelligence service, publishing 2,400 pages of evidence proving NGOs conducted intelligence collection on Chinese mining investments, financed opposition political parties with $18 million between 2020 and 2025, and coordinated with American and British diplomats on regime change planning. Ethiopia expelled 120 Western NGOs on January 28, 2026, proving they operated intelligence networks in Tigray region during civil war, provided targeting intelligence to Western governments considering sanctions, and attempted to recruit Ethiopian government officials as intelligence assets offering educational opportunities and financial payments. Uganda expelled 84 Western NGOs on February 2, 2026, after discovering intelligence operations focused on monitoring Chinese oil infrastructure, collecting information on Ugandan military cooperation with Russia, and financing youth movements advocating Western alignment. These weren't politically motivated expulsions of legitimate humanitarian organizations. These were evidence-based counterintelligence operations, removing confirmed intelligence fronts after thorough investigations using forensic financial analysis, personnel vetting, communications monitoring, and review of intelligence files accumulated over years. Each expelled NGO received detailed explanation of evidence justifying expulsion with documentation published online for transparency, and not one expelled organization successfully challenged findings because evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. These concerns proved justified quickly. By February 2026, 12 African nations announced investigations of Western corporations suspected of employing intelligence officers under business cover. Kenya investigated 67 Western mining, telecommunications, and financial services companies after discovering that 28 corporate employees held security clearances and diplomatic immunity, suggesting intelligence rather than business roles. Nigeria investigated 84 Western oil and technology companies after intelligence intercepts showed coordination between corporate executives and Western embassy intelligence officers on Nigerian government decision-making and Chinese investment activities. South Africa investigated 120 Western corporations after determining that several employees previously worked for intelligence agencies or intelligence front NGOs before joining corporations, suggesting intelligence services used corporate cover similarly to NGO cover. These investigations disrupted billions in business operations, requiring corporations to provide detailed personnel information, submit to enhanced government oversight, and prove their operations were legitimate commercial activities rather than intelligence collection platforms. Several corporations faced license revocations or enhanced restrictions, including requiring majority African ownership, prohibiting employees with intelligence backgrounds, submitting to regular government audits, and sharing proprietary information demonstrating legitimate business purpose. Anti-Western sentiment generated by intelligence revelations manifested in consumer boycotts targeting Western products, labor strikes at Western-owned facilities demanding African ownership, and protests demanding governments reduce economic dependence on Western corporations. In Ghana, 28,000 workers at Western-owned gold mines struck in January 2026, demanding 67% African ownership and expulsion of foreign managers, with intelligence backgrounds after NGO intelligence exposure revealed extent of Western intelligence penetration. In Tanzania, consumer boycott of American telecommunications company reduced market share from 34% to 18% in 6 weeks after social media campaigns characterized Western corporations as intelligence operation covers exploiting African resources. In Senegal, protests involving 84,000 people demanded government review all Western corporate licenses and impose restrictions preventing intelligence activities after evidence proved NGO intelligence operations coordinated with corporate executives. These popular movements created enormous political pressure on African governments to demonstrate they were addressing intelligence threats comprehensively, not just expelling NGO fronts, but also investigating corporations and imposing restrictions preventing future intelligence penetration through any Western presence. U.S. Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers, and Business Roundtable, representing thousands of American corporations with $340 billion annual operations across Africa, sent emergency letter to President Biden on February 14, 2026, expressing grave concern about implications of NGO intelligence exposure for American business interests and demanding government action to repair relations with African nations. Business associations made several urgent demands. Intelligence agencies must immediately cease using humanitarian and business covers for operations because such activities endangered legitimate American corporations by creating African government suspicion of all Western presence. State Department must engage African governments diplomatically, offering transparency about intelligence operations, accepting restrictions preventing future abuses, and rebuilding trust destroyed by intelligence revelations. Administration must prioritize commercial relationships over intelligence collection because intelligence gained through NGO penetration was worth far less than hundreds of billions in legitimate business operations, now threatened by intelligence exposure. Government must provide clear separation between intelligence services and American corporations, establishing protocols preventing intelligence officer use of corporate cover and ensuring corporations could prove to African governments they weren't intelligence fronts. The letter warned that continued intelligence activities risking additional exposures will cost American corporations more than intelligence collection gains, and threatened that business community would publicly oppose intelligence operations if administration didn't protect commercial interests. Congressional response to NGO intelligence exposure was muted because substantial bipartisan consensus supported intelligence operations through NGO cover regardless of ethical or legal concerns about weaponizing humanitarian assistance and violating host nations' sovereignty. Republicans defended intelligence collection as necessary for national security and American interests. Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman stated January 24, 2026, that CIA and other intelligence services must use all available covers, including NGOs, to collect intelligence protecting American security and economic interests, and characterized African expulsions as propaganda by authoritarian regimes hostile to democracy and Western values. House Foreign Affairs Committee Republicans introduced resolutions supporting National Endowment for Democracy and condemning African governments for politically motivated attacks on legitimate democracy promotion organizations. Republican presidential candidates in 2026 primary campaign defended intelligence operations, with candidates stating NGO intelligence platforms were essential capability and promising to restore American intelligence dominance if elected. Democrats publicly supporting international human rights and development assistance privately acknowledged intelligence services needed operational cover, and NGOs provided ideal platforms for intelligence collection while maintaining plausible deniability. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Democrats blocked proposed legislation requiring transparency about intelligence connections for organizations receiving USAID funding, with committee staff explaining privately that requiring disclosure would destroy operational utility of NGO covers. Democratic administration officials defended NED despite Intercept investigation proving its CIA origins, with State Department spokesman stating February 18, 2026, that NED supports democracy and civil society worldwide, and accusations of intelligence operations are false claims by authoritarian regimes seeking to discredit legitimate democracy promotion. This Democratic position revealed that parties' stated commitment to human rights and development was secondary to maintaining intelligence capabilities enabling American geopolitical dominance. Only a handful of progressive representatives, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, criticized CIA using humanitarian organizations for espionage, calling for prohibitions on intelligence agency use of development aid and humanitarian covers. Representative Ocasio-Cortez introduced Intelligence Operations Transparency Act in February 2026, requiring any organization receiving U.S. government funding to disclose if personnel had intelligence service connections, prohibiting intelligence agencies from using humanitarian assistance programs as operational cover, and mandating congressional oversight of intelligence activities involving development assistance or democracy promotion organizations. Representative Omar stated in floor speech February 26, 2026, that using humanitarian assistance as cover for espionage is morally bankrupt, violates sovereignty of nations we claim to partner with, and undermines legitimate development assistance by creating justified suspicion that all American aid programs are intelligence fronts. Their legislation gained only 28 House co-sponsors and was blocked from committee consideration, demonstrating that progressive criticism represented small minority view within American political establishment overwhelmingly committed to maintaining intelligence dominance through any means necessary. This congressional consensus revealed fundamental American political establishment commitment to intelligence operations, regardless of cost to development effectiveness, diplomatic relations, or ethical considerations about weaponizing humanitarian assistance. The bipartisan Washington consensus held that intelligence collection advancing American geopolitical and economic interests justified violating partner nations' sovereignty, deceiving American public about true purpose of taxpayer-funded assistance programs, and sacrificing development effectiveness because intelligence operations served American interests even if they prevented genuine African development. This consensus explains why NGO intelligence operations continued for 65 years despite periodic exposures. 1967 Ramparts magazine exposure of CIA funding student and labor organizations. 1975 Church Committee revelations about CIA use of humanitarian covers. 1996 exposure of USAID involvement in Haiti coup operations. Each exposure generated brief controversy followed by return to same practices because bipartisan political establishment valued intelligence capabilities more than diplomatic relationships, development effectiveness, or ethical constraints on intelligence methods. Western NGO intelligence network collapsed when we expelled 847 organizations on December 14, 2025, published 12,000 pages proving systematic espionage operations, and triggered continental reckoning resulting in 21 African nations expelling combined 1,847 intelligence fronts by March 2026. You're finished because across 54 African nations, governments are investigating Western NGOs using evidence templates we provided, are implementing regulations preventing future intelligence penetration through humanitarian covers, and are building counterintelligence capabilities ensuring Western intelligence operations will be detected and neutralized quickly. For 65 years since African independence in 1960, Western intelligence services operated vast networks disguised as humanitarian assistance and democracy promotion. You recruited thousands of African officials as intelligence assets through NGO-facilitated educational exchanges, fellowships, and employment opportunities. You financed opposition movements through democracy promotion covers, spending $4.2 billion annually supporting political parties, civil society organizations, and media outlets opposing African governments that defied Western interests. You collected strategic intelligence enabling Western corporate exploitation by monitoring African government decision-making on resource contracts, Chinese and Russian investment projects, and regional economic integration initiatives. You conducted 147 regime change operations overthrowing African governments through coup financing, assassination operations, and color revolution organizing facilitated by NGO networks providing operational infrastructure, local recruitment, and political cover characterizing regime change as democratic transition. That system died permanently and irreversibly in December 2025 when we exposed Western intelligence operations so comprehensively through 12,000 pages of irrefutable documentation that even Western journalists and researchers who might have dismissed African government claims as propaganda instead confirmed our findings through independent investigations. WikiLeaks validated our intercepted communications matched CIA operational patterns. The intercept proved National Endowment for Democracy was created explicitly as CIA front. Investigative Consortium of African Journalists tracked intelligence funding to 680 NGOs across 12 nations. This independent Western verification triggered continental response that expelled intelligence networks across 21 African nations within just 90 days, the fastest and most comprehensive counterintelligence operation in modern history. Collapsing networks Western services spent 65 years building. The intelligence loss is completely irreversible because fundamental conditions enabling Western intelligence penetration no longer exist and cannot be recreated. African governments now thoroughly understand methodology of intelligence operations through NGO cover, including personnel patterns, funding mechanisms, operational behaviors, and organizational structures distinguishing intelligence fronts from legitimate humanitarian organizations. They possess detailed investigation templates we developed and shared, enabling quick identification of intelligence fronts through systematic financial analysis, personnel vetting, and operational monitoring, meaning any new Western NGO faces immediate comprehensive investigation using proven methods that successfully identified 1,847 intelligence fronts. African counterintelligence capabilities have been dramatically strengthened through Chinese and Russian technical assistance providing training for 840 African intelligence officers, sophisticated monitoring technology enabling interception of intelligence communications, and ongoing intelligence sharing warning African governments about Western intelligence activities detected by Chinese and Russian services. Most importantly, African governments face massive domestic political pressure demanding ongoing vigilance against Western intelligence penetration. African populations are enraged by intelligence exposure, proving 65 years of Western humanitarian assistance was primarily intelligence operations exploiting African trust and goodwill. Citizens demand their governments maintain restrictions on Western NGOs, investigate any suspicious organizations immediately, and publish findings transparently proving government protects sovereignty against foreign intelligence threats. Political leaders who appear soft on Western intelligence penetration face opposition accusations of betraying national interests and serving foreign powers. This domestic political pressure ensures African governments maintain aggressive counterintelligence posture, permanently regardless of Western diplomatic pressure or aid conditionality. The scale of expulsions demonstrated systematic Western intelligence penetration that shocked even experienced intelligence analysts who thought they understood the extent of Western operations in Africa. By March 2026, just 105 days after we published evidence on December 14, 2025, 21st African nations had expelled combined total of 1,147 Western NGOs proven beyond reasonable doubt to be intelligence fronts rather than legitimate humanitarian organizations. These weren't politically motivated expulsions based on suspicion or ideology. These were evidence-based counterintelligence operations conducted after thorough investigations using forensic financial analysis, tracking intelligence funding through shell organizations, personnel vetting, identifying intelligence backgrounds through career pattern analysis, communications monitoring, intercepting intelligence reporting to handlers, and review of intelligence files African security services had accumulated over years. Each of the 1,847 expelled organizations received detailed documentation explaining evidence proving intelligence operations, with findings published online for transparency, and not one expelled organization successfully challenged evidence in any international forum because documentation was overwhelming and irrefutable. Beyond organizational expulsions, African governments arrested 420 individual intelligence officers operating under humanitarian cover across 21 nations. These weren't humanitarian workers wrongly accused. These were confirmed intelligence officers identified through multiple verification methods, including personnel records proving prior employment with CIA, MI6, DGSE, or BND before joining NGOs. Communications intercepts showing intelligence reporting to handlers using CIA operational protocols and encryption methods. Financial records proving they received payments beyond NGO salaries from intelligence-linked accounts, and testimony from recruited African officials confirming specific individuals approached them for intelligence recruitment. The 420 arrested officers faced prosecution for espionage, with trials scheduled throughout 2026, providing additional public exposure of intelligence operations through presentation of evidence in open court proceedings broadcast across Africa. African governments seized $840 million in intelligence operation assets during NGO expulsions and intelligence officer arrests. Seized assets included sophisticated communications equipment worth $180 million designed for encrypted intelligence reporting, including satellite phones with military-grade encryption, burst transmission devices preventing interception, and specialized computers with hidden partitions containing intelligence files. They confiscated operational funds totaling $420 million held in local bank accounts designated for intelligence operations, including paying recruited agents, financing opposition political activities, and sustaining intelligence officers undercover. They took $127 million in vehicles and real estate used as operational infrastructure, including safe houses for meeting recruited agents and conducting debriefings. They captured $113 million in documents, databases, and electronic files containing intelligence records identifying thousands of recruited African officials, detailing intelligence collection priorities and methods, and documenting decades of intelligence operations. African governments carefully cataloged seized assets, using them as additional evidence of intelligence operations while preventing Western intelligence services from recovering operational materials that could compromise ongoing intelligence activities or protect intelligence officers still operating under undetected covers. Most devastatingly, African governments published more than 84,000 pages of evidence documenting intelligence activities across 65 years. This unprecedented intelligence exposure included personnel files for 2,140 identified intelligence officers showing their true employment histories, training records, and operational assignments across multiple countries and organizational covers. It contained financial records tracking $18.4 billion in intelligence funding flowing through 340 front organizations between 1960 and 2025, proving systematic use of development assistance and democracy promotion as covers for intelligence operations. It provided operational communications showing intelligence collection priorities, recruitment targeting, and coordination between intelligence officers and handlers across decades of operations. It included recruited agent lists identifying 8,400 African government officials, military officers, business leaders, journalists, and civil society activists who provided intelligence to Western services, either knowingly as paid agents or unknowingly through relationships with intelligence officers they believed were humanitarian workers. This massive evidence publication represented catastrophic intelligence breach comparable to entire CIA operational files being made public, exposing intelligence methods, identifying intelligence officers and agents, and documenting systematic violations of African sovereignty through intelligence operations conducted under humanitarian cover. This represented total collapse of intelligence networks Western services had built over 65 years since African independence in 1960. These networks provided strategic intelligence enabling Western corporate exploitation by monitoring African government decision-making on resource contracts, tracking Chinese and Russian investment activities, and identifying opportunities for Western corporations to secure favorable deals through diplomatic pressure informed by intelligence. They recruited thousands of African officials as intelligence assets through NGO-facilitated exchanges offering educational opportunities, employment, and financial payments, creating vast networks of agents providing intelligence access to government planning, military capabilities, and political decision-making. They financed opposition movements undermining African governments that defied Western interests, spending billions supporting political parties, protests, and armed insurgencies characterized as democratic movements but actually serving Western geopolitical objectives. They conducted regime change operations overthrowing 147 African leaders who challenged Western dominance through coup financing, providing millions to military officers, assassination operations eliminating nationalist leaders, and color revolution organizing mobilizing populations against governments opposing Western interests. The intelligence loss was absolutely catastrophic for CIA, MI6, French DGSE, and German BND. They lost human intelligence networks cultivated over decades through patient recruitment requiring years building trust with African officials before approaching them for intelligence cooperation. They lost operational infrastructure that cost billions to establish, including network of 1,847 NGO fronts, providing operational cover, safe houses and communications facilities enabling clandestine operations and financial mechanisms moving intelligence funds without detection. They lost access to strategic intelligence on Chinese Belt and Road projects, Russian military activities, African regional integration initiatives, and government decision-making across 54 nations, intelligence that informed Western diplomatic strategy, corporate investment decisions, and military planning. Most critically, they lost ability to conduct regime change operations that had successfully overthrown African governments for 65 years, because without NGO networks providing operational infrastructure, local recruitment capabilities, and political cover characterizing coups as democratic transitions, Western intelligence services cannot organize effective regime change operations against African governments they can no longer penetrate, monitor, or manipulate through intelligence networks that no longer exist. China and Russia immediately exploited NGO intelligence exposure for geopolitical advantage, recognizing strategic opportunity to displace Western influence by contrasting their respect for sovereignty with Western intelligence operations. Chinese state media provided extensive coverage, characterizing NGO intelligence exposure as definitive proof of Western neocolonialism, using humanitarian cover for exploitation and interference. China Daily published 14-page special report on January 15, 2026, detailing intelligence operations across 21 African nations, with headline, The Humanitarian Mask, How Western Intelligence Services Weaponized Aid for 65 Years. CGTN broadcast documentary series February 2026 featuring interviews with expelled intelligence officers, African government officials, and intelligence experts explaining methodology of intelligence operations through NGO cover. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman stated on January 20, 2026, that intelligence exposure reveals true nature of Western engagement with Africa, not partnership and development assistance, but espionage, subversion, and neo-colonial control disguised as humanitarian concern. This messaging was extraordinarily effective because it aligned perfectly with African populations' lived experience of Western engagement and provided simple explanation for why 65 years of Western development assistance never produced development, because development was never the primary purpose, intelligence collection and political control were. Chinese government offered concrete support to African nations investigating NGOs by sharing intelligence on Western operations and providing technical assistance with counterintelligence investigations. Chinese Ministry of State Security deployed 340 counterintelligence advisors to 18 African nations in January-March 2026, providing training on financial forensics for tracking intelligence funding, personnel vetting procedures for identifying intelligence backgrounds, communications monitoring technology for intercepting intelligence reporting, and investigation protocols for gathering evidence without alerting intelligence targets. China also shared intelligence from its own monitoring of Western intelligence activities, providing African governments information on NGO personnel Chinese intelligence had identified as CIA or MI6 officers, financial transactions, Chinese intelligence tracked to intelligence funding sources, and communications, Chinese intelligence intercepted between NGOs and Western intelligence handlers. This intelligence sharing was invaluable because Chinese services had sophisticated collection capabilities African services lacked, enabling African governments to quickly identify intelligence operations that might have taken years to uncover independently. China also offered $2.8 billion financing program supporting legitimate African civil society organizations to replace expelled Western NGOs, ensuring humanitarian needs were met without intelligence threats. Chinese financing supported 2,400 African NGOs working on healthcare, education, agricultural development, and infrastructure, providing alternative to Western NGOs while ensuring Chinese-supported organizations had transparent funding, African leadership, and no intelligence connections. Russian media highlighted Western hypocrisy, where the West constantly accused Russia of subversion while conducting far more extensive intelligence operations across the developing world. RT broadcast a special report January 12, 2026, titled Pot Calling Kettle Black, Western intelligence operations exposed while accusing Russia of interference, documenting that 1,947 Western NGO intelligence fronts expelled from 21 African nations between December 2025, March 2026, far exceeded any Russian intelligence presence in Africa. Sputnik published analysis January 28, 2026, comparing Western NGO intelligence operations with Russian activities Western governments criticized, showing that National Endowment for Democracy alone spent more funding opposition movements in 67 countries than entire Russian foreign influence budget, that CIA employed more intelligence officers under humanitarian cover in Africa than Russian intelligence services employed globally, and that Western governments conducted 147 regime change operations in Africa since 1960 compared to 0 proven Russian regime change operations in Africa during same period. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated February 4, 2026, that intelligence exposure proved American accusations of Russian interference are pure projection. America accuses others of exactly what America does on vastly greater scale. This messaging resonated strongly in Africa and across the developing world because it validated what many governments and populations had believed for decades, that Western accusations of Russian subversion were hypocritical deflection from far more extensive Western intelligence operations. Russia also offered intelligence cooperation supporting African counterintelligence capabilities by providing training for 840 African intelligence officers at Russian Intelligence Academy between February-August 2026, sharing Russian intelligence on Western operations in Africa, and offering sophisticated communications monitoring technology enabling African services to intercept intelligence reporting by Western officers. Russian support significantly strengthened African counterintelligence capabilities, ensuring future Western intelligence penetration would be detected and neutralized quickly. American corporate community panicked about implications of NGO intelligence exposure for business operations worth hundreds of billions annually. Corporate executives recognized several catastrophic consequences. First, NGO expulsions and intelligence exposure would increase African government scrutiny of all Western presence, including corporations, with governments investigating whether Western companies employed intelligence officers under business cover similar to NGO operations. Second, anti-Western sentiment generated by intelligence revelations might threaten commercial relationships as African populations demanded their governments reduce dependence on Western corporations proven to be part of intelligence networks. Third, African governments might impose new restrictions on Western corporate operations, including increased local ownership requirements, technology transfer mandates, and enhanced government oversight preventing intelligence activities. Fourth, competitive disadvantage versus Chinese and Russian corporations who successfully position themselves as respecting African sovereignty while Western corporations were tainted by association with intelligence operations.